is Jane Nelson, and it is my great pleasure to moderate our opening discussion on catalyzing private capital flows for development. And I'd like to, in addition to welcoming everyone who's in the audience here in Washington this morning, welcome those of you who are joining in our web audience, and we believe from a number of companies around the world. And for those of you who are live tweeting, just to remind you to please use hashtag GPF15. So our focus this morning is going to be on the role of private capital flows. And in the opening plenary of the Global Philanthropy Forum a couple of days ago, President Jim Kim of the World Bank, I think, gave us all a very clear and compelling call to action when he said that if we're serious about addressing and achieving more broad-based growth and sustained poverty reduction, it's going to be essential that we marshal the collective energies of the public, private, and social sectors. And I think the leadership challenge for all of us here today, regardless of which sector we work in and which country we work in, is what does that actually mean in practice? How do we mobilize the collective energy of different sectors? And how do we move from a compelling vision of shared prosperity and eradicating extreme poverty to achieving practical results on the ground? And how do we shift from very important global dialogues about sustainable development goals, financing for development, to local and national solutions which are having a real impact in the quality of people's lives and in the opportunities that they have? And I think one of the key questions related to that is, what is the role of the private sector, of private companies, private investors, private financial institutions? And how can the private sector be a more effective and accountable partner in development? And that's what we're going to focus on in today's panel. And we have four fantastic panelists to get us going on this discussion. And there are really three questions that I hope we can try to answer this morning. First of all, how do we increase the amount of private capital and get it to where it's most needed, to the projects, to the sectors, to the countries where it can make the biggest difference? So the first is about how do we increase the quantity of private capital. Secondly, how do we improve the quality of private capital? How do we ensure that it has a positive development impact and at a minimum does no harm and doesn't have a negative impact? But how can we actually ensure that it creates what my colleague Michael Porter and Mark Kramer describe as shared value, and actually creates business benefits but also development impact? And how do we measure that development impact and report and account on it? And then thirdly, how can private capital, private companies, private investors work more effectively in partnership with donors and philanthropists to have greater scale and impact than we can have on our own? So those are the three questions we're going to explore. How do we increase the amount of private capital and get it where it's most needed? How do we enhance the quality and the development impact of that private capital? And how can private investors partner with philanthropists like you here in the room today? And I'd like to start, I'll introduce each of the panelists one by one as I come to them, but I'd like to start with you, Gavin Wilson. Gavin is the Chief Executive Officer of IFC Asset Management Company and has many years of experience investing and working in emerging markets with McKinsey & Company, the World Bank, and Goldman Sachs. And I think you've done assignments, Gavin, in over 60 countries around the world, so great deal of experience in this area. And the IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank. It was created way back in 1956. So I would argue has been probably the world's pioneer in both being a champion but also a channel for private sector investment in development. And it would be great to hear from you, Gavin, what's different today, what's happening now, and what are some of the key trends that people here should be aware of?
Sure, okay, well, Jane, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I think this morning's conversation, and in fact the conversation all year as we lead up to the SDGs later in the year, is going to be very different from the conversation we had 15 years ago at the time of the Millennium Development Goals. And one of the reasons for that is the relative importance of private capital, and for that matter, philanthropic capital. 15 years ago, official development assistance was the game. I mean, that's what it was all about. A lot of the discussions at the time of the MDGs, but also at Monterey, which was the equivalent conference back then to what's going to be happening in Addis Ababa in July this year, around the whole issue about, okay, how do we finance these various goals? And 15 years ago, this was very much all about rich countries committing to certain development assistance targets. By the way, some countries met those targets, some didn't. But private capital wasn't really part of the discussion, and many of the organizations that you all represent didn't exist. There's been a great flourishing of philanthropic interest in this whole area. There's also been a lot more activity by private capital, both business itself and investors. So that is the first big change, is that if you look at just the pie, instead of development assistance being about 50% of what we're talking about, it's about 10%. So therefore, I think everyone has now reached consensus, and I think we will see this emerge more explicitly in some of the documents that emerge from the various UN processes that are going on, that it's all about how do we mobilize private capital. So the way we look at it as a public institution, a multilateral that's owned by governments, that only invests in the private sector, and where every time we invest in something, we're trying to mobilize other private capital alongside us. The way we look at it, in a sense, is not how do we leverage the private sector, but actually how do we leverage the public sector? How do we take this finite amount of official flows that we do have, and by the way, the more the better on that, but given that it's finite, how do we leverage that to the maximum extent? And one of the ways we do that is to try and make sure that everything we invest in meets two fundamental targets. One, that it's good for development, and two, that it makes money. And those are the two fundamental, because that's the way we are sustainable from a financial perspective as well as from a development perspective. Now, we don't always get it right. That's our objective ex ante, but we're funding 500 or 600 projects every year, so there are always going to be mistakes. But ex ante, we try and hit both targets at the same time. And I think we'll have time to discuss this a bit later, but one of the things that we've noticed when we look back post facto at everything we've done is there is actually a very high correlation between those projects we've funded, which have been good for development, and those which have actually also been profitable. And I think we can come back to that sort of a bit later in the discussion. Yeah,
great. No, super good. And can you also say something about how you're not only making the investments and mobilizing the capital, but giving advice and the sort of the technical assistance that supports it to improve
absolutely
impact?
So, in a sense, our fundamental business is to provide finance to private sector projects in developing countries, but alongside that, there are two or three other things we do. One is give advice. Some of that advice is to governments to help sort of create the right sort of environment. Some of it is directly to companies that are trying to either find financing or do things like improve their supply chain management to make sure there's sort of sufficient local content, for instance, in the extractive industries, or if it's in the banking sector, help with credit appraisal skills. How do you access, for instance, we've got a whole sort of line of business that involves lending money to commercial banks in developing countries, but on the condition that that is on lend to women-owned SMEs, okay? Now that sounds simple, but actually there's a whole series of sort of technical aspects of that, which we help and we bring advice alongside the money. And then the final thing, and this is the bit that I'm personally responsible for, is attracting third-party capital, whether it be pension funds, whether it be sovereign wealth funds, whether it be foundations, to invest with us in IFC projects. And that is a relatively new thing, and I think is a symptom of some of these things I've talked about, is the increasing importance of philanthropic and private capital in the development space.
Great, no, thank you. And I think this is a sort of an area where I think we're going to see a lot more development, that sort of intermediation function where you are bringing together private capital, philanthropic capital, government capital in a blended finance model to have greater impact. And we'll come back and look at some examples. But I'd like to move next to Mirza Jahani, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Aga Khan Foundation and started life as an economist with the UK government's Department for International Development. And Mirza, like the IFC, the Aga Khan Development Network is probably the other great pioneer over 45 years of experience in both sort of supporting community-led, community-owned development projects, but also investing in private enterprises in arguably some of the most challenging and difficult frontier markets in the world. And so I'd like to sort of hear from you a little bit about some of the examples and models that you're using, you're particularly to invest in very difficult places where private capital often doesn't go.
Great. Thank you, Jen. If you will permit me, I would like to just put up the image of a framework agreement partnership that we have with the US government and other investors. Bear with me, it looks complicated, but I'm going to make it very simple. This framework idea of a partnership emerged from a conversation between His Highness the Aga Khan and the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton about 4 years ago, when they were sort of musing over what could be done in Afghanistan which would make a major difference. There would be a different way of doing development. So they asked a group of us staff members to get together and to try and develop this new way of working. And many of the aspects of the Aga Khan Development Network, many of the things that we do well about bottom-up development, about investment, about trust funds, we wanted to bring that together in one framework. And this is the unique thing about this partnership, that it brings many of the dimensions that we have really had dilemmas about for a very long time in development. So very quickly, the green box that you see there, the Platform for Social Development, is area development that we do, which His Highness coined the term multi-input area development. We all talk about it at this conference this week. There's been a lot of talk about breaking down silos, doing integrated development. So that box is all about, how do you bring health, education, microfinance together to really make accelerate the development process. Once we've done that, we've always been challenged by the fact that it's a 5-year project. And you all know very well that development is much, much longer than 5 years. So we've been looking for a way in which you can sustain some of those gains into the future. And when we started asking that question, we quickly realized that it was economic drivers that really brought about sustainability. They created money, incomes, jobs, all of those things. But more than that, if it was enlightened investment, if it was quality investment, as you pointed out earlier, maybe that could do a lot more than just create jobs. So with this framework, we've got this investment vehicle that we are putting together, the sort of purple boxes that you see up there. And the idea of the investment vehicle, which will be $30 million, the whole partnership is $60 million, $30 million for social development, $30 million for investment. The idea of the investment vehicle is not only to make one investment and be done with it, is to actually create an equity fund that can then invest in a whole load of different projects, telecommunications, power stations, agro-processing, a lot of the sort of things that IFC has actually helped Aga Khan Development Network do in other parts of the world. But we wanted to make sure that those investors who came in with us, including the Aga Khan Fund for Economic Development, did not just take all the profits back out. So we created this trust fund mechanism where even more enlightened investors than the Aga Khan network have said, our profits, a portion of our profits, are going to stay in the trust fund.
Okay.
And that closes the loop back down to sustainability, because the trust fund, again, something that we've talked about at this conference, how do you give people a voice, a decision-making in their own development, is what the trust fund is all about. And the trust fund will be governed and managed by the people of Afghanistan for the things that they want to do, for the things that, remedial training of teachers, improving clinics, whatever sorts of things that green box does not completely finish. This trust fund will help continue with that. It's not the panacea for for sustainability, but it's a crutch, a support for that. I think it's a powerful framework. It brings a lot of things together. And since my time is running out, I think interesting questions from the audience would be, how do you actually create a platform for social development? How do you make that green box actually work? And how do you actually set up a trust fund in a very, very fragile environment of Afghanistan? I would love to answer those questions.
Great, good. So make a note, folks, out there, but yeah. And can you also sort of say something very quickly about how you are a foundation, so do you think other sort of philanthropic foundations can get more involved in both, so this dual sort of side of sort of program-related investment as well as setting up trust funds?
Absolutely. I mean, the beauty of this framework is everybody's invited to the table. If somebody said to me, I want to support Afghanistan's ECD, early childhood development, go to the green box. If somebody says, I really am just interested in a power station, I would say go to the pink box. If somebody said, hey, gee, that trust fund is never going to be big enough, I just want to donate to the trust fund, you're most welcome. It's a framework that really brings, we talked a lot about partnerships and none of us can do everything. This really gives you that partnership. And the beauty is that even if you do ECD support in that framework, you know that it's going to be sustainable. You're at the table saying to the investor in the power station, you're not giving enough profits. What's going wrong there? It's fascinating. It's not easy.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a minefield of lots of challenges. I've got scars. It's 2 years in. I've got lots of scars on my back because, people look at me and say, well, you didn't think of that, did you? And I'm saying, no, we didn't think of that. But the whole point is, it's a process.
Great. And I think a great example of the sort of disruptive innovation and sort of new models that we need and we've been talking about. So thank you. But I'd like to come now, Christianna Wood, to you. Christianna is currently the chair of the board of the Global Reporting Initiative, which has become in the last sort of 10 years the global sort of standard setting group for sustainability reporting and standards, mostly for private companies, but also for non-profits and governments. And before that, Christy, you've had over sort of 30 years managing large amounts of institutional investments around the world. She was the chief executive officer of Catalyzing Asset Management, but before that was a senior investment officer at CalPERS, the California Pension Fund, one of the largest pension funds in the world. And I think you were responsible for something like $150 billion in assets under management, and it's a useful reminder of just how much pension fund money and assets are out there. And it would be great to hear from you, Christy, with your background as an institutional investor over many years. What more could we be doing to attract more private capital, specifically to developing countries and to development priorities?
Well, thank you, Jane. And on behalf of the GRI, it's really a pleasure to be here. The GRI is a foundation that's been around for about 20 years to set non-financial reporting standards. And when you think about what institutions need in order to infuse capital into emerging and frontier markets, perhaps the most important thing is trust. Obviously, financial integrity, financial reporting, and the integrity of markets is important. And as a capital markets person myself, I have to say that I always start there. But you need perhaps more than that. You need transparency on the non-financial side. And so what the GRI does is set standards for environmental disclosure, social disclosure, and governance disclosure so that institutions, whether it be philanthropists or any institution, can have a greater degree of certainty that there is accountability on the other side of the transaction, that this entity is going to be accountable to all stakeholders, and the GRI is a multi-stakeholder framework where we get into a room, not just civil society and labor, employers, companies, employees, academics, what we call mediating institutions, which is a fancy word for accountants, and we decide, well, what is it that investors and capital providers really need to know in order to provide capital in a sustainable long-term in a development scenario. And we're in our 4th generation now of those standards. But I do think that it is confidence and trust that the entity that's actually receiving the money is going to handle it in a responsible way. So, for example, I'll just name a few things. You know, are they going to have an employee base which is representative of the community as a whole? Are they going to provide a safe and fair work environment? Will the profits and the burdens of the entity be fairly shared among all stakeholders? And those are the kinds of questions which need to get answered, I think, in order for capital to be deployed in a development scenario.
Great, good. And do you see sort of potential for large sort of multinational companies to be working more with pension funds in deploying capital?
Well, you know, I do, and I mean that usually happens in vehicles like private equity, where you know, for example, the pension funds are just one of many investors, but in fact, more and more pension funds are taking equity stakes and actually originating funds in, for example, clean tech and all sorts of vehicles that I think are consistent with GRI type values. But yes, I do think companies can partner up with pension funds in order to do that. It's a little bit difficult. You have to provide the appropriate vehicles to address both public monies and private monies, but I do think that it can happen. And really what the GRI is it's a filter for development monies to come into emerging and frontier markets, so that there can be this trust. And so just as an example, the GRI gets funded frequently by developed nations who want to trade with developing markets and want to have accountability and trust in that the money is being responsibly handled on the other side. So we try to penetrate these emerging markets and try to raise the quality and the quantity of transparency on non-financial reporting.
Great, excellent. And I hope we can come back to this. I think this trust question is absolutely essential, and I'd like to come back and explore that a bit more. But first, last but certainly not least, my good colleague and friend here, Frederic Sicre, who is the managing director of the Abraaj Group, and before working at the Abraaj Group was a managing director of the World Economic Forum and led a lot of the World Economic Forum's initial work in Africa and the Middle East. And Fred, the Abraaj Group is one of, again, the pioneers, I think, in the field of private equity investment in developing countries, with over $7 billion now in assets under management, $9 billion in assets under management. Can you give us your sort of insights from the perspective of private equity? What more could be done to mobilize private equity?
So, from where we sit, I think we are going to see more capital, to answer the question, going into these emerging markets. We call them growth markets, simply for purely mercantile and commercial trends, which I hope I can share with you and not be thrown out of the room, but just taking a very acute business and investor sort of perspective on these markets, where we're coming to a point where 75% soon of global GDP growth is coming from these markets, where there's going to be soon 1.5 billion more middle-class consumers existing in these markets, where the average age, also the demographic trend that we see, the average age in these markets is 27 years old compared to an OECD average of 40 years. And what that means is there is demand that is coming up over the next couple of years from this young population that is growing, that is aspiring to jobs, and because they are aspiring to jobs and aspiring for more, are also moving into the cities. And so this trend of urbanization, which is a very real and trend, there's about 1 million people in these growth markets every week that are moving into cities. We're becoming an urbanized humanity across the planet. That's the equivalent of 8 New York cities every year that are moving into those cities. So when you look at that from an investment perspective, you can either see a lot of challenge or a lot of turmoil, or you can see a lot of opportunity. And that's where we see, as a private equity group, and it might be a little bit bizarre to, if we were sitting here in a private equity conference, it might sound a little bit bizarre if I was to say that the SDGs for us are making a lot of sense. Because if you look at how these sustainable development goals are evolving, they are in part talking about exactly these kind of challenges. They are calling for more investment into energy. And so when a private equity firm like us invests in the Karachi Electric Supply Company, and we turn around a company that's meant to supply the city of Karachi with electricity, and we turn that company around, private capital can have a positive impact and has a role to play. When you look at the issue of this urbanization of cities, it means that people are no longer going to be eating the chicken out of their backyard or, trading rice with their neighbor. They need packaged goods. They're living in cities, and that is offering massive opportunities for investors like ourselves as well. And then there's the whole issue of health, which also the SDGs are calling for, investment into health. And that is a huge opportunity, a challenge, but also an opportunity for private capital to flow in. And we've had experience in this with an African health fund that we put together with the Gates Foundation. It's a small fund that we put together a few years ago, and whereby we decided to aim for the bottom of the pyramid and provide access to health in Africa in about 4 or 5 countries. And what was quite interesting about that fund is the amount of carried interest that we would obtain as a fund manager was dependent on the amount of people that we could prove we touched at the bottom of the pyramid. So even though we are a hardcore private equity investor, we do also, like the IFC, look at the impact, and we seek about impact, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is going to be more private capital going into these markets simply because of these trends. It reminds me, you're from Africa. Thomas Bata, I don't know, the shoe manufacturer, he invested in Africa, I think 30, 35 years ago, at a time where people were not really investing all that much on the continent. And I remember a journalist asking him, "What are you doing? Nobody invests in Africa. How come you're investing in Africa?" And he said, "Well, I came to Africa and I looked around and I saw that about half the people don't wear shoes here." So, and it's, I say that with a lot of respect, but there is a massive opportunity in these markets.
Yeah. Great, no, thank you. And I think a great example there of that, and then that multiplier effect by investing, you're not only, in this case, delivering the shoes or the health products, but you're creating jobs, you potentially improving corporate governance and other sort of critical development impacts. And I'd like to sort of come to that question now of both impact and how do we measure and assess the development impact, and then use that to build trust between the private sector and other sectors. Because I think, and it's sort of come out a couple of times in conversations in the last few days, that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to both understand each other between the philanthropic sector and the social sector and the private sector, but also to build trust. And I think there's a real onus on the owners of private capital, private companies, to demonstrate that at a minimum there aren't negative impacts and externalities from large private investments, but at the positive side, that there are measurable development multipliers and positive impacts. And so, Gavin, I'd like to come back to you with the years of experience that the IFC has in sort of assessing and measuring development impact, and what are sort of some of the lessons and what are some of the models that you're using to both measure it and then use it to sort of account for that impact and build trust.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you, Jane. So first of all, it's an evolving subject, okay? So I think anyone who comes up with a definitive way of measuring development impact will get a Nobel Prize. But for economics, not for literature. And they would deserve it because it is, it is extremely difficult. Now, what do we try to do? So every time we assess and then ultimately fund a project, we will set up what we call internally, it's just an internal system, development outcome tracking system, DOTS, we call it for short. But even that is something we're trying to sort of move on from. But what DOTS does is basically it requires us every time we do a project to say, okay, in this particular case, what are the 7 to 8 things that we're going to measure, not as an attempt to try and capture the entire impact, but just some of the key aspects, so that we have some way of looking back 5, 10 years later and working out whether we actually achieved some of the objectives we thought. So some of it is purely measurement for the sake of having something to look back at. Some of it is measurement for the sake of actually deciding which projects we actually fund, because if you're not able to articulate what those particular outcomes are that you're going to track, then that tells you something about whether or not it makes sense itself. So that is what we have, but we've also tried to go beyond that in 2 respects. One is to have a more general sense of reach. So when it comes to, for instance, access to finance, simply how many people have we, either directly or through the financial intermediaries that we invest in, have we sort of touched in the sense of they now have some sort of saving or just simply checking account arrangement with a financial institution. Likewise, how many SMEs, in particular subset of that, how many are women-owned or women-managed? And in the case of agribusiness, how many farmers have we done? So it's a sense of reach, how far, and it's similar to the base of the pyramid point that Fred was making. How many people have we actually sort of touched? Then we confront the issue about, well, if that's how you're going to measure it, aren't you going to do everything in China and India and forget about the small countries? Because with the small countries, you're not going to reach so many people. So we have to make sure that anything we do, it doesn't become an absolutist, that's all we're going to look at. We've got to use a lot of judgment. And what we're trying to do now is focus a little bit more on what are the indirect effects, whether you call it a multiplier effect or whatever, is, you know, particularly with jobs, which of course has become even more important in the last few years than it was before, particularly in jobs. What are the indirect effects of an investment in a particular area? Now, the one thing we'll say, we have at the World Bank Group and an independent evaluation group, they have looked back at a number of sort of projects that we have financed, particularly on the equity side, because we do debt and equity, but particularly they've taken the subset that are equity. And they have done some analysis which has, in its most simplistic form, is simply a 2x2 matrix, which is for all the projects in a certain time frame, how many did well financially and did well on impact, and how many did neither or one of the others. And what's interesting is that almost every project, well over 90%, were in either the top right or the bottom left, i.e. they did well on both or they did badly on both. So I'm not saying we're perfect. I mean, there are lots of projects that don't work as we intend. But what's interesting is the correlation. There are very few where there have been a financial success but didn't do much for development, or they did a lot for development and, you know, but actually weren't a financial state. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because the company, we essentially are funding growth. So the companies that grow are the ones that hire more people, pay more taxes, tend to have more sort of professional management team that can think about things like environmental impact, you know, HR policies and standards, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of goes together. Not 100% of the time, but what we're trying to do is just sort of gradually channel the funds that do exist into those projects where we think people have a focus on development impact and are most likely to actually be able to achieve it.
Excellent, great. And can you also, sort of building on that, say something about the role that the IFC has played in sort of setting standards in certain industries where there has been controversy of potential negative impacts?
Well, so about 15 years ago, we brought a group of commercial banks together to create something called Equator Principles, and that is slightly ancient history now, but was quite important when it came to big project finance and some of the policies that the commercial banks now increasingly adopt when it comes to lending practices in big infrastructure projects. But more recently, we have something which we call IFC performance standards, and maybe it's not the best sort of phrase, but it's something that we require every single business that we invest in to adhere to. And we update it every now and again. It can get a bit controversial. Some people think we go too far. Some people think we don't go far enough. Our objective is to essentially try and stay one step ahead, because if we get 2 steps ahead, nobody's going to follow. But if we're 1 step ahead, then we have a reasonable chance of people actually saying, yeah, okay, we'll adopt these standards. It's particularly effective, or it is particularly well known, let's put it that way, in the private equity world. So a lot of the private equity fund managers who operate in emerging markets will just say to, when they're out sort of raising money, not necessarily with us, but with others, they'll say, yes, we use IFC performance standards. And we're basically saying that they have an environmental, social, and governance framework which they use to look at investments. And actually, you could even say that fund managers in emerging markets are more focused on this issue than fund managers in developed markets when it comes to private equity.
Yeah, no, and where there can be such a great impact. And Fred, it's probably a good segue to you, and to give a practical example as a private equity firm, how you are really consciously trying to improve the sort of social and environmental impact of investments and setting standards.
I think, just to pick up from where you left off, you can call it ESG, environmental social governance, you can call it impact, or you can just call it common sense. When you're investing in these kind of companies, especially at the spot at which we're investing, which is we're not doing VC work, we're not doing large buyouts, we're doing really those mid-cap investments where we're backing up an entrepreneur often that's been building this business for a number of years. And it's really a sweet spot to have a massive impact at that particular time in the life of a company, because you can institutionalize it. You can put in the right frameworks of governance, as you were mentioning. You can also help that business aspire to opening up new markets for itself by looking at its own sales and markets through the lenses of social sensitivities or environmental sensitivities. It's not just about cutting costs, it's really about opening up new markets. So as a private equity investor in these markets, certainly environmental, social, and governance principles that we abide by are just common sense practicalities in terms of training, making sure the employees that have a certain amount of training per day, safety of your employees. These are maybe things that in the US or in Europe don't need to be thought of. But when you're investing in these kind of markets, you do have an opportunity of putting in these kind of systems and processes in your investments. So as a private equity investor, that definitely does happen. And we do go around, by the way, when we're raising capital from people saying that we do use the IFC performance standards. So, and we tried to, 2 years in a row, we reported under the GRI, but no matter how hard we tried, we only got up to a B+. And the reason why we can't get to an A, and we're the kind of company that likes to always aim for an A, is that last time we looked, there's no principles for private equity industry per se in the GRI, but I think those still need to be developed.
To be discussed. Yes.
I can help you there.
Okay, good.
Good. Yeah. And Rosa, I'd like to come to you on this question of impact, and particularly, I think you've been very effective at making sure that the local communities and the beneficiaries are involved in the actual process of assessing impact. We'd love to sort of hear how.
Can I just pick up on a couple of things that came up just prior to me? I would love to look at your right-hand box, if we can look at that data. I would love to compare companies within that, because one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about is there such a thing as abnormal profits? It's all very well to talk about staff safety, it's all very well to talk about numbers of women in your management and all those wonderful things that all these rating agencies look at. But I wonder whether there's another dynamic that we need to ask and think about, is that are profits so high that perhaps staff should have been paid more, or perhaps the product should have been cheaper? It's an interesting dynamic, and I would like to look at those right-hand companies and see which ones of those are really, truly for for the benefit of the society rather than for profits. But that's just something that came to my mind. The Aga Khan network, because of our area development approach in that framework that I showed, multi-input area development, we're all about improving people's quality of life. So for us, the major statistic, the major thing that we look at is, has people's lives improved as a result of these multiple inputs in health, in education, in incomes, in voice. So we have a composite index, which we call quality of life index, which we will do every second year in each of the geographies where we operate. Attribution is very difficult when you do that because we're not the only players in that area. Government is by all means a major player there, but also, power stations and other things that are coming up or which are not necessarily of Aga Khan network. But we are still struggling to improve that data. A lot of the numbers thing is about outputs, not necessarily impact. I can tell you that 1,000 more girls went to school in this area as a result of our work. But I can't easily tell you that those 1,000 girls became better citizens or were truly educated better in those classrooms. So we are still struggling with that notion of what is truly impact. The other thing we're struggling with is the quality of the data that we're collecting, especially in these very fragile places. And we are beginning to look at innovative ways in which the data is collected by those to whom it should mean the most, i.e. the people themselves. We all collect data in our own households, in our own lives. Why should people out there not want to collect data for themselves? Providing the data is of importance to them. So that's at the cutting edge of our thinking. I know other better than us organizations are doing that as well. They call it live data, or they call it real-time data, where households are putting in data as things change in their lives to give us an indication of what's happening. But I think that's our major lesson, that what's the incentive for collection of data? And absolutely, it's what does it mean to me, not what it means to the World Bank or to the Aga Khan Development Network in Paris. It's what it means to them. And I think that's the sort of the next evolution of our data collection that we're looking at.
Great. And I'm assuming are you sort of using technology to do that?
That's
and can
right.
you say a bit more about that? Because it's not only giving people voice and the capacity to build the data, but the opportunity to have more of a say where they want things to go.
It's a very simple thing. Like with the mobile technologies, mothers can actually now tell you how their child is growing. Yeah. Do you remember when I started in development? I don't know how many other health professionals are there. They used to have growth cards. Do you remember growth cards that were made out of paper? And by the 5th time the mother came to the clinic, it was all fraying, and it was all... Well, all of that data can be collected now on a mobile. And she can tell you, without coming to the clinic, I weighed my child today, this is how much he weighs, he's in that growth curve, everything is fine, I'm not panicking, I don't have to spend 20 shillings to come to a clinic with the bus, I'm fine. And you, as a health worker, know, hey, that's fine as well. But that data doesn't just stay there, it gets transmitted to other centers very quickly. So that's one example of the sort of thing that we think technology is going to help us get real-time data very quickly. And if there's an epidemic, if 20 kids in that village are showing low growth in their weight, well, there's a crisis, there's something happening. You don't have to wait till the quarterly report gets to the World Bank, and the World Bank guy says, ooh, this looks a bit strange, and it's 3 years on from the data that was collected, 2 years ago. So I think that's what it's all about now. It's quite exciting in some ways.
Great. And I think, again, a great example where philanthropy can play a role helping to build some of that capacity in collecting the data and then the ability of communities to do it themselves. But I'm going to open up very shortly to questions. So if you've got questions, if you can get ready to pose them to us. But Christy, any comments from you on this impact measurement and how your business can improve its development impact?
Well, a couple things. First of all, I just want to be sure after Fred's remark that everyone knows that any entity can use GRI guidelines. The City of Chicago is a GRI reporter, the U.S. Army, the London Olympics, the Port of Los Angeles, They're all GRI reporters. So any entity, now your score, I can help you a little bit maybe later on, but I really think I want to put this in perspective a little bit in terms of the magnitude of the reporting world. 20 years ago, no entities reported on non-financial, really of any great scale, non-financial factors. Currently, KPMG does a study every other year, and if you look at the 41 countries in the world that they track, of the 100 largest companies, you've got about 73% of the 100 largest companies reporting on GRI-type frameworks, almost all of it's GRI work. But once you go below the 100 largest companies in these markets, it really drops off quite dramatically. And in order to get the kind of transparency that is needed to deploy significant amounts of capital into the SME space, we really need to drive more reporting and better reporting, so that you can have the kind of confidence to deploy capital, and there will be I think some trust involved. And I think the only other thing I would add to that is that there are developed countries, let's say I'll just use the Netherlands, for example, that are funding the GRI because they do trade with Colombia, and they want to be sure that in their trade relationships that we drive the reporting framework into these countries, and we do it in Ghana, and we do it in South Africa, and so a number of countries. So there is, I think, a multi-purpose agenda here to drive better transparency, better reporting, and I would just say, add to that, the GRI is reported in 26 different countries in their regulatory framework, and is in 16 different languages. So it's very widespread, but we really need to drive it into the SME world, and so we're working on having implementation of the SDGs for SMEs.
Great. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity, sort of calling on companies to disclose what they're doing to support the SDGs. Correct. And improve social environmental management. So even if it's not specific requirements on what's disclosed, just getting companies to disclose what they think the priorities are will help to improve accountability and
exactly.
Disclosure. Yeah. Thank you. Great. So I see we've got a number of hands here. So I'll take several at a time. So over there, and then we've got two here. So let's take three, and then we'll come back to the panel.
I'm Preeti Sinha. I work at Yes Bank in India. My question's on using philanthropic or multilateral funds, since we have players here, to create that guarantee structure, the first loss, so that more private sector money can come in. So, for instance, a social impact bond, etc. So I haven't heard anything about that discussion. We also had President Jim Kim here yesterday. So thank you.
Great. So how we can use philanthropic funds to catalyze? Yep, over here.
I have a question about GRI, and do you have a third party going into the companies to confirm what they're saying in their reports? And if you can be more specific of what's the process?
Great. So that's sort of independent assurance and analysis. Very, very important point. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mona Mwafi. I lead an organization called Rise Egypt, and actually piggybacks nicely on the last question, which is that these structures that you lead, or these companies and organizations, are sort of at the macro level, and when you drill down into SMEs, you're really getting on the ground. And then the difference between output and impact is often measured with development studies, whether you're piloting, an impact study or whatever, which is really specific to the actual implementation. So what are the processes that you're all using to get from here to here? Are there mediating organizations that you work with that do this, that can help maybe do some of this verification, work directly on the capacity building to help with the measurement of impact? How are you getting from sort of these targets and measures that are up here to ensuring that there's a linkage with SMEs on the ground?
Great. So, Christy, do you want to take the independent assurance question?
Yes. Well, in many countries there is independent assurance, and it's performed. Let me just say, any of the big four accounting firms would love to be paid to do assurance on non-financial reporting, and they are completely staffed to do it. But there are less costly ways. There are other consulting firms that do it. But the other thing I guess I'd say is that there is a small army of trainers and consultants who do who know how to do GRI reports, and they're spread across the world, but you're correct in that the quality of the information needs to get a lot better. I'm not going to go so far as to say that greenwash is an issue, but I think we have to be careful that some of GRI reports lack, I think, the kind of integrity that we would want. But this is what happens when you have a voluntary framework and you have a voluntary uptake. Because in most countries, let's just take the United States for example, you cannot get a regulatory requirement, and we can't exactly treat it like financial assurance and financial reporting. So you're right. We need to get better information, and it can be done. Institutions do hire consultants, and in fact, there are a lot of highly trained and highly skilled people out there to write high-quality GRI reports. So, but we've got a lot further to go.
And I think one other point building on that, I think there's a great opportunity for the NGO community to play a role. And so Oxfam, for example, has developed the poverty footprint framework, where they're actually working with companies and working with communities on their ground to assess impact. So I think there's some creative things we can do, to make sure that the reporting does have integrity, and that the communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is an area where we're going to see quite a bit of growth. But who would like to sort of answer the question on the role of the philanthropy in? So first of all, Gavin, and then Mirza. Yeah.
So look, I think it's a great question, and what's happening now is a lot of so-called blended capital. What do we mean by that? It means where you've got different types of capital, it's kind of coexisting. Purely private, purely public, philanthropic, mixtures, etc. Now, sometimes it's all pari passu. Everyone's just investing in the same thing on exactly the same terms. I actually think that that's not a bad thing at all, because sometimes to get something going, you need those first commitments, and then once some people have come in, everybody else kind of piles in, and you need to have somebody who kind of seed things, okay? And we use this phrase catalytic quite a lot, and the catalyst has to actually touch the other compound to actually have the catalytic effect. So I think that in itself is good, but there are many ways of applying concessionality, and what we try to do is whenever there is a concessional provider of some form or another, is we try and use that as effectively as possible. It could be simply concessional terms on a loan, it could be first loss protection, it could be a technical assistance kind of fund that sits alongside the project, it could be any sort of combination of that. It could be a loan that is only repayable once the project becomes profitable. So there are lots of very creative ideas, and each organization has its own kind of rules of the game in terms of what it can do. And I think the key is for us just to continue to try and be as innovative as possible, and if necessary, just restructure things a little bit to accommodate all the different providers of capital. And I think that would be the sort of generic comment I would make. But there's lots of great thinking going on this, and on social impact bonds, green bonds, etc. That's a whole different story as well. And that itself is really sort of catching on, and we could have a whole different sort of debate on that. But I would say the common theme there is people are now thinking of creative ways of channeling the different types of capital into, in a sense, projects that actually sort of mesh with the objectives of the particular organization providing the concessionality.
Great.
Yeah, I think similarly in that framework I was talking about, the investment vehicle already has at least one investor who is giving first loss. And I think it's just remarkable. The way I try and explain this to other philanthropists is that you can give $100,000 to build 2 or 3 schools. But if you give $100,000 as first loss in an investment vehicle, that might leverage $10 million or $1 million, and you may be able to do 50 schools instead of the 2 or 3 that you could do with your $100. So that's the way to look at it. But there is a dilemma that's emerging, in at least in the Aga Khan network, which is that as more and more people become interested in impact investment, or new types of investment of this sort of nature, will it cannibalize the donation giving, the grant giving? And I think it's a very important question for philanthropists to think about, because in looking at first loss types of funds, I wouldn't want people to say, well, that's a much better idea than giving untied grants, because there's huge amount in that green box that still needs to be done, that deserves a lot of philanthropic dollars. But there are ways of leveraging, as Gavin was saying, which we ought to look at. I'm conscious we haven't answered Mona's question about intermediaries.
Do you want to?
No, I mean, I would say that for everything that we do, it's all bottom up. Yeah. So even though it looks like it's all top down when I'm speaking, a lot of these ideas have emerged from the people themselves. And we would never actually make a health or education or even an investment decision without people's participation. And they're the most important in our work at the end of the day. So there are structures that cascade both ways, upwards and downwards.
Great. Fred, last sort of comment to you on the sort of question of how can philanthropy sort of play a role in catalyzing more private capital?
Well, in our experience of working with philanthropists, there's certain areas that we like to work with philanthropists with. We take as an organization 5% of our top line, not our bottom line, but our top line, and 5% of annual bonuses and 5 days of time per employee that go into working with organizations like many of those that are represented here in terms of addressing either entrepreneurship, stimulation programs. Innovation is another sector that we invest in our time and philanthropic capital a lot. And the third is on youth and the next generation. And again, you know, these sectors are all sectors where we have a skill set that we can contribute. And I think this blended, it's not just about blended finance, it's also about blended expertise. Many different parties bring different kind of experiences around so that you can try and really have impact in a sustainable way on the ground. And through these programs, we've worked with about 70 organizations over the last 10 years. We've touched the lives of about 500,000 people. And it, again, you know, sometimes in these kind of fora, I say investment bankers do have a soul. And it's true that, it is true. I mean, sometimes they just need to help, a bit of help to rediscover it. But in the organization that I work in, it hasn't been an easy path, but certainly more and more of the 300 people that work in Abraaj are participating a lot in these kind of programs. And it makes them better citizens, but it also makes us much more smarter about the places in which we're investing, because it embeds us into the social fabrics of the communities and of the places that we're investing in. So again, it's a two-way street. In our view, there's no need to forsake financial returns for having impact. You can do both at the same time at many different ways.
Great. No, and I think it's a great point to close on. I think just three sort of closing comments from my side. When we're talking about this question of mobilizing private capital for development, I think there's almost like sort of three levels of opportunity we can look at. One is the so-called purely sort of commercial investments, whether it's foreign direct investments with big companies or commercial portfolio and private equity investments. And the focus there is to, at a minimum, ensure that there are standards and independent assurance that the investment's not having negative impacts. But I think enormous opportunities to really optimize the positive development impacts and get better at measuring those positive development impacts of the commercial private investment. Secondly, I think very excitingly is this area that came from your question of the blended finance, impact investing, where one's using different types of capital, different motives, blended together to achieve a sort of set of goals which have both financial return, but also a more explicit social return. And then thirdly, very importantly, and I think it's important to finish this panel on this point, the ongoing role of philanthropy and grant making in its own right, whether it's capacity building, whether it's improving data collection, whether it's for advocacy purposes, that we mustn't lose sight that there's going to continue to be that need for the philanthropy and the grant making. And I think it's those three things together, commercial private capital that is really focused on having a positive development impact, the blended finance and sort of impact investing models and the new instruments and opportunities from those, and the ongoing importance of traditional philanthropy and grant making. And I think it's that combination of the three together that probably give us one of our greatest hopes to achieve this broad-based growth and poverty eradication that we're all aspiring to. So on that note, I'll thank our panel very, very much for your insights.